You also have SQLite. So what was SQLite, if you're familiar from past experience? Yeah.
It's a SQL database that's contained within a single file.
Perfect. So it's a SQL database, so you get select and insert and delete and update and all the semantics of SQL, but you don't actually have a full-fledged database running on the server. It's just all stored in a binary file, one single file on disk. So this is nice for portable devices where you're not going to go install MySQL or Oracle onto an iOS device, but you'd really like to retain the expressive capabilities of SQL and selecting and joining and the like, so you can still do that with something called SQLite. And you can do this even in the PHP world and web world, and even I do it for projects sometimes where I want the code base to be super portable and not require someone to create a MySQL database for me for reasonably sized data sets. Everything then can stay isolated within a directory. You can store things in XML itself. With iOS 5, you can store things in JSON, with which you're probably familiar from the web world. And then there's an abstraction layer called core data that also allows you to not have to worry so much about the underlying technology that you're using, but still store relationships among objects. So a quick tour of a very common design pattern in iOS apps. So thus far, we've only looked in any detail at the utility application and single view. Now it's time for master detail. And the code here is going to be a little more complex, but the paradigms we'll see are going to be the same as those we've seen before. So in a master detail application, when you run it outside of out of the box, you get this, which sort of looks like a canonical iOS application, which you can't really see it on the screen here, but there are little horizontal lines there that represent rows in a table that if you click and drag, I am the only one that can see that something's moving here. That just looks like white on the projector. But if there were actually things in here, I could click edit, and then all of a sudden I could start deleting what are emails, for instance, on an iPhone, or text messages or whatever. So this is a table view in iOS speak. So how do we go about coming up with a view? Can I zoom in and then you see the lines? OK, there's slight little lines there. So the goal is to make this big white interface and actually put stuff in it. So let's take a quick look here. You start off looking at an application, whether it's your partner's code or some template or some project off the web. How do you start to wrap your mind around how it works? How do we start this tour when no one's telling you in a PDF where to look? All right, so let's look at the app delegates. I'm going to start with the .h because that's usually the smaller of the two, and there's nothing in here I haven't seen before. So I'm going to turn my attention then to the M file. In the M file, let's see. There's a little something of interest here. It's a little ugly because of the font size, but let's see what's going on. Self.window, that looks the same. OK, so this time it's not instantiating a main view controller or a view controller. It's apparently called master view controller. And this is instantiated, it looks like, the same as before. But this is interesting, navigation controller. So it turns out that this class here is actually implementing, let's see, master view controller. So notice that the master view controller object is not inheriting from UI view controller, but from UI table view controller. So again, this has to do with OOP. So there is UI view controller, which is the thing we've been talking about for 2 weeks. But this is a more specialized version of a UI view controller that allows you to have tables so that when you click on one of those entries, everything slides to the left and you see more data. Click again, slides to the left, just like an email inbox or a lot of data-based applications. So this is apparently descending from this. So the app delegate is simply saying this is going to be the class that drives this whole application. All right. Well, down here, it's all comments, comments, comments. So that's just the stub code that we're going to ignore. If I go into masterViewController.m, it looks like now, oh my God, there's actually a lot of code here that seemingly needs to be understood. But let's not worry about that so much for now. Let's just focus on the method names. And we can kind of cheat here and look up in here. So in this file, we apparently have these methods defined. At the very top, we have init with nib name bundle. So init, any init method is essentially like the method that does the initialization of the object. So that happens to be inherited from a parent class. View did load, when does that get invoked? Silly question. When the view loaded, right? So after any nibs have been unserialized and the view has been loaded into RAM before the user sees it, that gets called in case you want to make some tweaks like we did with hello and hola. View did unload is the opposite. Should auto rotate to interface orientation, does what it says. Insert new object, that has to do in this case with just inserting a new row into this table. But now things get interesting down at the bottom. So under the bold-faced table view here, we apparently have all of the methods that are somehow involved in the display of tabular data with iOS. So let's actually take a look at this, but in the context of a concrete example where you can actually see the rows. So I'm going to go ahead and open up an example here in today's code called plist for property list. And let's take a look at what I actually included in this code. It's very simple, but it's based on a very similar model of that. So small.plist. This is an XML file that has only the 4-letter words that we described at one point in the spec for project 2. So what is this thing actually? Well, let me go into my file system and go into plist, not Pong. Oh, Pong is coming, by the way. plist, and small.plist. Let me go ahead and open this with a text editor. So when we keep saying these things are XML, it literally is. So I just made that by hand with a text editor, storing those words in what's called an array element. And Xcode then simply depicts this for me in these little drag and drop interface like this. So small.plist contains these words. And my goal for this application is to make, wait for it, this. All right? I know. Took me a while. So let's motivate this so you actually care. So maybe you want to display high scores in a game where you've got the data stored in some storage format. Maybe it's a property list. Maybe it's SQLite. But the point is you have to select that data and then iteratively add row, add row, add row, add row. How do we get to the point of a UI like this? Well, let's take a look over in the code. So I actually started this example to keep things simple with just the single view template. So I didn't get a whole bunch of code from Apple that I had to then understand. So my app delegate is the same as usual. My viewController.m, though, or actually let's look at the nib, is quite simply this. All right, this is a silly little thing that Xcode does, whereby when you create a table view, you get these default California locations. These are just, that's their representation of a table view. That data is not actually there. How did I do this? Well, let's undo it and redo it. So that's what I started with, as with any application. And if you scroll down in these widgets, down, you'll see table view. I literally just dragged and dropped that into the interface. So I could get some kind of table view. And then, so that I could actually talk to it, notice what I must have created. There's these two linkages. So a table view has two properties that come with it. One called data source, which is going to be a pointer to whoever is going to be giving me the data to fill out these rows with. One is called delegate. That's the guy that in the other direction I am going to inform when the user does something. Now, what might you do with a table view or any application that has just tabular data? You being the human. Again, softball question. You might touch the screen, right? You might click the edit button. Any of these user interactions might trigger events. Who do you want to delegate responses to? Well, it's whatever the delegate is. So notice that they're both mapped to files owner, and files owner is, as before, view controller. So the implication is that I'm going to ask that object for the data to display. And when the user touches or interacts with that data, I'm going to inform that same object. So let's take a look then on the left-hand side here of what I actually had to implement. So in viewController.h, notice what I've done. It descends from viewController because it just came from the default template. And now here, let's take a look at a couple of design decisions that I had to make. So one, I implemented this method, init with nib name bundle. So you can have init methods. And we looked at that in the student class and those examples we made ourselves. But now that you're starting to use the iOS SDK itself, you can't just make an init method and hope that someone's going to call it. Because indeed, you want this method, you want to put your initialization code in the method that's actually invoked. So notice what I did here. In my app delegate, I noticed that, all right, well, when a view controller is allocated, this is the method, init with nib name bundle that's actually called. So I wanted to learn a little something about that. So I held option, or control rather. No, option. And then notice it becomes blue. I click on it. I get a little cheat sheet, sort of like a man page for it. If I click on the book, I get the full-fledged documentation for this class. And indeed, this is the method that's called to return a newly initialized view controller with the nib file in the specified bundle. So what's a bundle? Bundle generally refers to the application itself. Like when you compile your code and you include all the images and source code and plist in it, that's a bundle. So what did I do? I simply copied the method signature here, like you might have done from a man page in C. I then went into my code for my view controller, pasted it, and then I started implementing it. So I did stuff here. All right, so what did I do? This is the stuff I put in there. So this recalls the paradigm from last week that you just have to do when writing your own init method. You call the superclasses identically named method. You assign the return value to yourself. And if the return value is non-nil, nothing went wrong. You can proceed to do your initialization. So this is like checking for null in C. Well, what do I want to do when this application is loaded? I want to simply load all of the words from that property list. So how do you do this? And this is actually germane to project 2 if you choose to use property lists. Well, first I construct a string called path. And then I ask the main bundle, that is the thing the user has installed on the iPhone, to give me the path